Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture, where we will be focusing on a few key skills related to reading assessment. And so by the end of this unit, you should be able to understand why reading evaluations are important and how they help us support learners more effectively. We'll also look at how to observe reading behavior and why those observations actually matter. You'll learn about enacted or records, what they are, why we use them, and how to write them after having a metacognitive interview with learners. In addition, you'll be able to understand the importance of curriculum-based assessment, the importance of recording the results, and interpreting what those results mean. And finally, you'll bring everything together by writing a report on a learner's reading assessment, which you will be conducting, and combining all of your findings and making thoughtful recommendations. And so let's start off with just laying the premises in regards to the importance of reading. Now, around 80% of learners, according to literature that is out there, with learning disabilities struggle with reading. And that is quite a significant number. And understanding how reading works can help both general as well as special education teachers see why these learners have such a hard time learning to read fluently. It is important to note that today, we get our information from all kinds of sources, such as TV, the internet, as well as podcasts. So reading isn't the only way to learn anymore. But still, reading remains a critical skill. And it is also essential for keeping up with job training, staying employable, and participating fully in society. In fact, literature has shown that poor reading skills are often linked with school dropouts, unemployment, poverty, and even juvenile delinquency. And many of our biggest educational and social problems are actually closely tied to reading difficulties. And so how we understand reading from a cognitive view is quite important as assessors, because from a cognitive psychological perspective, as Dr. Fourie has indicated, reading is not just about decoding letters. It's actually also about building meaning. And this happens through a constant interaction between the reader, the context, as well as the text in which the reading takes place. So just a few key ideas from the cognitive view approach that really informs reading. We need to understand as assessors that reading is constructed. Reading don't just take words into consideration. They actually also create meaning based on what they already know. So, for example, someone who sees the word utilities might think of electricity, unless they already know it's referring to computer programs. Reading, therefore, must be fluent. And it is important for us to, therefore, understand that recognizing words quickly and automatically is essential. And if learners have to stop and sound out every word, they can't really focus on the meaning of the text. That's why learning to break the code early, as Dr. Fourie has indicated, is quite important. And so we also need to understand that reading is quite strategic in its approach, because good readers adjust their reading style depending on the purpose, the difficulty of the material that is in front of them, and how familiar they are with the topic. They use strategies like rereading or asking questions when something doesn't make sense. We also need to understand that reading requires motivation. Now, learning to read takes time, and it's easy for struggling learners to lose interest or to give up. That's why it's so important for teachers as well as assessors to make reading enjoyable and meaningful. And I like the idea that Dr. Fourie shared in the previous sessions about being creative when it comes to reading, incorporating a game approach, for example, when teaching reading to younger learners. And then lastly, as assessors, we need to keep in mind that reading is a lifelong skill. Reading ability, continues to grow over time with practice. From the start, learners need plenty of chances to read and build their skill. So with all that in mind, we also need to keep the following in mind when assessing reading: word recognition as well as comprehension, because reading involves these two major components. And what do these two major components actually mean? While in terms of word recognition, this includes decoding words and just matching letters to sound and using strategies like phonics, sight words, context clues, and word parts like prefixes and suffixes. And learners need these skills to figure out unfamiliar words. In terms of reading comprehension, this is the ultimate goal that informs the reason why learners are taught how to read, because it is all about understanding what you read. When learners find themselves in secondary school, they are exposed to a lot of, especially in languages, they are exposed to a lot of reading comprehensions. In actual fact, that is part of the ongoing assessment throughout the secondary school exposure. Hence, when they are at primary level, it is important to really lay the grounds quite firmly when it comes to word recognition, because reading comprehension goes beyond recognizing words to thinking deeply about meaning, structure, as well as purpose. And so the work that you are doing with your case child is quite important so that um, so that we can identify quite early whether there are gaps so that support can be drawn alongside those learners in order to mitigate those gaps before learners find themselves in secondary level where they are expected to be able to apply all of those skills. So if the foundation is laid quite strongly, it really prepares learners to take on the challenges that comes with secondary school experiences in terms of language. And perhaps that in itself will deposit confidence in their self-concept by the time they get to secondary level, which therefore allows them to show up for the process of learning. Now, in terms of word recognition strategies, and Dr. Fourie spoke quite at length about these early reading skills, and I'm just going to mention them quite quickly, just again to lay the premises that will lead us towards the importance of why we are assessing reading. Now, in terms of the recognition strategies, firstly, in terms of phonics, learners learn to match sounds to letters. And this is often called breaking the code, as I've previously mentioned. And to do this, they must first understand that words can be broken into smaller sound units, a skill called phonological awareness. And then we also have sight words. And these are words that readers recognize or should recognize instantly. And many high frequency words don't follow typical spelling rules like the word was or said. So they need to be memorized. And that is also a skill that Dr. Fourie emphasized on. And then we have context clues. And sometimes the words around an unfamiliar word can help learners guess its meaning. And practicing this with real stories is one of the best ways to learn. And then we also have structural analysis. And this involves just breaking words into parts, into prefixes and suffixes, into root words and syllables. And it helps learners figure out unfamiliar words by understanding their structure. And then lastly, we use strategies, combining the strategies or using the strategies together. And skilled readers often use multiple strategies at once. And so learners with learning disability need repeated practice with each strategy to become confident and flexible readers. And so understanding what you read in terms of reading comprehension, it is important that comprehension, which means making sense of what's on the page, is a skill that they acquire at an early age. Even learners who've learned to recognize words might still struggle with understanding more complex texts. So good comprehension really just depends on the reader, what knowledge and interest they bring to the text that is presented to them, as well as the text itself, how clearly it is written and how it is organized. And then also context plays a very important role in good comprehension, where and why the reading is happening. So, for example, an assessment situation can make a learner quite anxious, and that in itself can affect their understanding of the text that is in front of them. And as an assessor, you need to be able to take note of that, because it will inform how you articulate or give meaning to the results of the assessment, because these factors constantly interact while a learner is reading. And if the content matches what a reader already knows, reading is easier. If it's unfamiliar or conflicts with their prior knowledge, it is harder. And if we take into consideration the emotional approach to learning, and there's the evidence of anxiety, one needs to take note of that, because learning is an emotional process. And if a learner is anxious, which therefore means that the limbic part of the brain is more active than the frontal lobe, then one needs to take note of that, so that proper interventions can be constructed for the learner that you are working with. So the three core concepts in reading comprehension that we also need to be mindful of is what learners already know, which I have emphasized, that matters quite a lot, because if they don't have enough background information, they won't understand the text, even if they can read the words. Now, I've been a high school teacher, and I've worked with learners from grade 8 up to grade 10, grade 11. And, in all of those grades, I have come across learners who are able to say the words that they read from the page, but when asked to apply understanding, a lot of those learners seem to struggle. And that is also because of the prescribed readings that we were called to make use of, which was not necessarily contextually relevant for the particular child which I was teaching at that point in time. So as assessors, you need to help learners build that knowledge. And so the second part of it is also the language process, because reading is tied to understanding how language works. And sometimes you can't figure out the meaning of a word or phrase until you finish the whole sentence. And understanding sentences or sentence structure and recognizing redundancy, like when something is repeated in different ways, can help with comprehension. And then also the thinking process that is part of the core concepts in comprehension, because reading is like solving a puzzle. Learners have to ask questions, make prediction, and figure out relationships between ideas. And they need to be taught to think critically and to actively engage with the text. Now, critical thinking is quite important when it comes to reading, especially in the times that we are living in, where learners now have access to ChatGPT or to these AI tools or platforms. And so it is important that learners are taught to think critically and to really engage with the text in order for them to build understanding and or comprehension on what they are reading. And then also in terms of comprehension skills that can be taught as assessors, apart from assessing the reading, a parallel approach to the assessment should be teaching perhaps comprehension skills as you are assessing. It's not about looking at what the learner is getting wrong, but being creative in a way to perhaps assess the same thing, but quite very differently, or taking a different approach. And that can be done by breaking down reading comprehension into specific skills. And one of the skills is noting details. For example, where you pick out specific facts. Perhaps you're giving the learner an entire comprehension to read, and you can see that the learner is struggling. After assessing and obviously noting down the first engagement to that comprehension, come back and reintroduce the comprehension perhaps differently by picking out specific facts, identifying main ideas, finding the central message, sequencing is also one of the approaches where you check or you try and help the learner understand the order of events or the steps, making inferences where you apply the ability of figuring out what the author means, even if it's not directly stated. Organizing ideas by recognizing how ideas relate to each other, and applying information using what was read to solve problems or make decisions, as well as just evaluating content where you create a space where the learner could perhaps judge the material for bias or relevance or logic. And this is all part of critical reading. And as assessors, these skills directly can help you think about possible interventions that you can recommend for the classroom experience of that particular learner. And it can significantly help improve reading comprehension, especially for learners with reading difficulties. And so with all that in mind, that brings us to the purpose of reading assessment and why we actually evaluate reading. Because reading assessment serves multiple goals, and each goal is aimed at better understanding and supporting, emphasis on supporting learners' reading development. Now, there is the diagnostic assessment that will help you find out where learners are standing. And before we can help learners grow, we need to know where they are starting. And diagnostic reading assessments help identify learners' current reading levels and uncover specific skill gaps. For example, if a learner constantly struggles with decoding unfamiliar words, a diagnostic tool can flag this as an area that needs targeted instruction. And then we also have the formative assessment approach, where you will be tracking progress and improving perhaps the instruction or the teaching. And these ongoing assessments will help you monitor how your case child or the learner is doing over time. They will provide you as the assessor with valuable feedback, just to tweak perhaps instruction based on the learner's needs, and to make recommendation based on the learner's needs. And if a learner or if your case child improves in fluency but still struggles with comprehension, you as the assessor can shift focus accordingly. So tools like reading journals or quick comprehension quizzes can really serve this purpose very well. And then we also have summative assessment, measuring what learners have learned. And with the summative assessments, you can use it to just evaluate reading proficiency at the end of perhaps at the end of your assessment. But this is obviously used in classrooms where proficiency in reading is looked at the end of the school year. And it is a standardized test that falls under the category of a learner's reading ability and readiness for real world literacy challenges, or whether the learner has the ability perhaps to deal with the more complicated content of the following grade. And then we also have skill development. This is based on building better readers. And reading assessments, for me, aren't just about measuring like that which is done in standardized tests. They're also a tool to help learners grow. They can encourage the development of higher order skills like analysis, inferences, as well as synthesis. And over time, learners also learn to take charge of their reading growth through self-assessment and reflection, which I believe, if it is implemented and it is a skill that is nurtured, will foster independence and confidence in learners. And then also cultural responsiveness, making assessment quite fair. Because let's just be honest, just because everybody is in the same grade, there is the expectation that everybody ought to be at the same place when it comes to certain skills. But the truth within the South African classroom is that that is not the reality. And so one critical aim is to ensure assessment works for all learners, regardless of their background, regardless of where they are in terms of their skill development when it comes to reading. And this might involve adapting tools like modifying reading systems within the classroom to better support perhaps indigenous or multilingual learners, because a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't cut it in a diverse classroom, especially within the South African context. And then also, part of your assessment approach for your case child will be based on the metacognitive reading interview. And this is basically to gauge or help you assess whether the child is able to think about thinking while reading. And a metacognitive interview really just explores how learners plan, how learners monitor and adjust their reading strategies. It's less about what they read and more about how they approach reading. And so what it looks at is basically planning. Do learners or do your case child think about their goals before reading? For instance, skimming the comprehension that you will be giving your case child for key points versus carefully analyzing the comprehension. It also looks at monitoring. Is the case child aware when he or she don't understand something, as well as regulating? Can the case child adjust his or her strategy, like rereading or summarizing, if he or she hit a confusing section of the comprehension which you have presented to him or her? Now, this tool is quite important because as the assessor who will be interviewing the learner, you as the interviewer will help uncover the learner's awareness of perhaps these strategies that forms part of how they navigate the reading experience. And so the semi-structured interview will just allow for deeper discussion, revealing the thinking behind their reading choices. What is important to keep in mind is that research shows that strong readers use more metacognitive strategies, and teaching these strategies explicitly, like predicting or summarizing or questioning, can really improve comprehension. And research also have shown that peer discussions and self-reflection enhances strategy use. Hence, this is part of the assessment for reading approach in this module. And if I have to give you a bit of a tip, I just want to mention that many learners are unaware of effective strategies. So as an assessor, you can help by modeling their thinking during reading and encouraging your case child to verbalize their strategies to you, because that will allow them to start thinking about how they approach the reading experience. And then also we have observation. And observation is a conversation that I think started in our second unit, and it is one of those approaches that is part and parcel of every assessment engagement you have with your case child, because observation or your observation in itself is a tool where you're constantly just watching and documenting how your case child is engaging with the assessments in real time. And this method will allow you to capture things that that the test in itself might miss. For example, um, um, as an assessor, as you listen, as the case child reads aloud, um, what you will be doing is just noting perhaps miscues and perhaps self-corrections that the learner is applying. And that in itself um, will reveal the learner's fluency, the decoding skills, and the problem-solving strategies that your case child is able to apply. Um, Especially if you use the early childhood settings, and this involves basically just taking brief notes on key developmental behaviors related to reading and learning, just being very cognizant of the fact of how the learner approaches learning. And this together will just offer a window into the real behavior of your case child when it comes to reading. And it will also help tailor instructions based on observed strengths and needs of the learner. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that this approach in itself requires careful and consistent note taking in order for it to be reliable. Um, and it may not assess comprehension. So it may not assess comprehension deeply on its own. Therefore, integration and triangulation of the information that you gather is quite important. And then also checklists, right? Which is quite a structured and simple evaluation approach because it's very straightforward, and it allows you as the assessor to just track various reading skills consistently over time. So it is important that you assess early skills like phonics and phonemic awareness. It is important that informal reading inventories that is applied is used to track fluency and comprehension. And it's important to think about whether the learner themselves can think about how they are approaching the reading exercise by listening in and taking note of what the learner shares with you. And so the challenge with this approach, of course, that we need to keep in mind that it risks subjectivity if not used constantly. And so it cannot be used by it standing alone. Again, this needs to be drawn alongside all of the other tools that you will be making use of when it comes to assessing reading. And then we also have the rating scales, and rating scales provide a more detailed view of reading performance than simple checklists. And the reason, therefore, is because it's quite holistic. One overall score, how well the learner reads the passage. And it also allows for analysis because it breaks performances into parts. For example, fluency, expression, and accuracy. For example, in assessing your case child or your case child reading aloud the comprehension that you present to the case child, an analytic scale might score them separately on pronunciation, on pace, as well as comprehension. That brings me to the anecdotal records, where telling the story behind the numbers is quite important, because this approach allows for a narrative observation of specific learner behaviors during reading. And why this matter is because it just captures the nuances that perhaps the assessment tools or the scoring of the child's reading ability would miss, like a learner's engagement and problem-solving strategies or emotional responses to a specific text. And it brings with itself, the strengths of being able to reach insights for personalized instructions, as well as it could be useful for early readers or those with learning differences. But it also has its limitation because it's time consuming and it is quite subjective. And I think it is best used alongside other tools for a fuller picture of the case child that you will be working with. So all of these tools do not exist in isolation, but they all work together for in order to create a fuller picture of the needs of the case child that you are working with. And then we have the curriculum-based assessment. The curriculum-based assessments that involves using the actual curriculum materials to assess the learners. And one of the key features of the CBA is oral reading fluency, where learners read aloud and their speed and accuracy are measured. And this gives a quick sense of reading levels and progress as well. And I'm quite aware that GDE has designed an assessment document that is normally applied or implemented by the SPST coordinator, where this is part and parcel of a document that is submitted to GDE if a child requires further support. And this allows for identifying struggling readers. It also allows for tracking improvement over time. But most importantly, it allows for tailoring instructions, example, focusing on fluency versus comprehension. However, we also need to take into consideration the limitations that comes with this approach, and that is that it doesn't always reflect comprehension in itself, and it needs careful passage selection or to ensure fair assessments. So keeping that in mind, we also make use of error analysis, which is all about learning from mistakes. And by analyzing the types of reading errors learners make, we can really pinpoint what they need help with. And there are different types of errors or miscues. There's phonological errors, there's syntactic errors, there's semantic errors, and there's obviously the omissions or the addition errors. Now, in terms of phonological errors, this is all about misreading similar sounding words. For example, the word cat, C-A-T, as cap, C-A-P. Then we have syntactic errors, which is grammar mistakes. For example, a child saying he go instead of he goes. And then we also have semantic errors, and this is all about wrong meaning. For example, the difference between happy or seeing happy as sad and seeing sad as happy. And then we also have the omissions or additions error where learners are skipping or adding words that are not part of the comprehension. And why do these matters? It matters because not all errors are equal. A word substitution that keeps the meaning, for example, joyful for happy might not be a concern. But if meaning breaks down, comprehension suffers. So what to do with the data? So using the scoring rubrics and track changes over time, if a learner consistently makes phonological errors, for example, focus on phonics instruction, and that will help you just come up with an intervention that will be quite specific in terms of the need presented for that particular learner. So what I want you to really take away from reading of assessment is understanding that diagnostic tools help us figure out where learners' needs are, or where learners need support. Things like rating scales, checklists, and metacognitive interview gives us insight into how learners actually engage with a particular text. At the same time, observations and error analysis show us what learners do in real reading situations. When we put all of this together, we get a fuller picture of a learner's reading ability. One that's comprehensive, sensitive to their background, and useful for guiding instructions. So preparing or conducting and following up on reading assessments, is quite important. I believe that before you present perhaps the assessments that you need to do with the learners on reading, go through the tools and understand the techniques that you would like to apply whilst doing the assessment. I want to encourage you to choose comprehension, comprehension or reading pieces that aligns with perhaps the learning goals. And be creative, as Dr. Fourie has indicated. The internet is full of good resources. Be creative in terms of what you make use and how you make use of it. Creativity could mean designing cards that have both words and pictures in order to help with the efficiency of the reading assessment. And then also what I want to encourage during the reading of assessment, what I want to encourage is basically you guiding, as the assessor, you guiding the learners with helpful strategies as you are assessing, like reading the text before tackling questions, by paying attention to signs of confusion or frustration, and just use that opportunity of assessment to draw alongside the learners and imparting perhaps skills as well, and not just waiting for a later stage where you now have to design an intervention that will need to take root within the classroom in itself. But use that space therapeutically as you assess reading, and perhaps try out support approaches alongside the assessment of reading. Take note of it, because that will inform how you will structure your interventions going forward. And then also after the assessment, perhaps review the results just to identify patterns. Just review all of the results together and not in isolation. Share the feedback and with the teacher, the relevant teacher, so that you don't wait until you have completed the final report at the end of the year, so that perhaps the teacher that is working with the child can start thinking about how to adjust the instructions in the classroom and set goals as well, and help perhaps the teacher that's working with a child to adjust instruction or interventions based on the need that you have identified, and maintain records of progress and monitoring throughout, because that will inform you as the assessor what needs to change, what needs to be approached quite differently. Because again, I remind you that the reading of assessment is not just about assessing reading, but also being quite flexible in terms of adapting to the needs of the child and identifying what works and what doesn't work. I always say implementation and intervention can sometimes be not 99% trial and 1% error. So when it comes to interpreting and reporting on or writing of the reading assessment, um, what I want to emphasize is that to effectively interpret and write a report on reading assessment, it is quite essential to follow a structured approach. And this involves analyzing the assessment results, as I said, drawing conclusions about the reading or the reading ability of the case child, and then presenting the findings in a clear and organized manner. And here's just a breakdown of this process, where it has an introduction to the assessment. And in the introduction, you give the purpose of the assessment, where you briefly explain why the reading assessment was conducted. And this could include identifying reading levels, diagnosing difficulties, or measuring progress, as well as identifying the assessment tools used by you describing the specific tools or the methods used for the assessments, such as standardized tests, running records, or informal reading intervention. That therefore takes you to the second part of it, and that is the overview of the reading, where you provide background information, provide relevant background information about the reader, including the age, the grade level, and any previous reading intervention or assessment. And then also giving context of the assessment in itself by explaining the context in which the assessment was conducted, such as the setting. Was it in a classroom? Was it on a one-on-one? The duration, and any specific condition that may have influenced performances. That will bring you to the third point, the results of the assessment, which is based on quantitative data, the overall reading score, the scores in specific areas, whether it's comprehension, fluency, or vocabulary, as well as the qualitative observations that I've spoken about. And then that will then bring you or lead you into the interpretation of the results, where you identify areas where the reader performed well. And this could include strong comprehension skills, fluency, or vocabulary knowledge, but also identifying areas for improvement, where you're highlighting specific areas where the reader was struggling. And this might include the types of miscues, as well as the comprehension challenges. And then when you've done that, you then provide a comparative analysis. So you compare the reader's performance to perhaps the benchmark or the norms for their age or their grade level, just to provide a bit of context. That therefore brings about the recommendations, where you make certain suggestions or suggested targeted instructional strategies just to address identified weaknesses. And this could include phonics instruction, for phonological areas, vocabulary building activities, etc. This will obviously inform your intervention plan, because by recommending specific interventions or programs that could support the reader's development. And that also brings you to the conclusion, where you will summarize the findings, as well as outlining the next step for both the reader as well as the teacher, including a follow-up assessment or an ongoing monitoring of progress. And so keep all of this in mind, not forgetting to include all of the supporting documents that you've made use of in order to assess reading. So thank you very much. What I want to conclude with is just by letting you know that reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. So keep that in mind as you engage with your case child going forward, and as you engage in the assessment of reading. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to stop the recording. And it is 10:04. I went 4 minutes over.